So we've been talking about graphs and to some extent how people behave in social networks, which is a graph. But what we haven't done is really had a model of how people make their choices. And these settings are complicated because in them people have to make a choice, but it's also the case that what they choose affects what others receive, affects others' payoffs. And that's important for them. But more important for an individual making a choice is that what other people choose affects your payoffs. And you have to take this into account in making your choice.
So maybe it's good to have an example in mind of what do we mean by this kind of game or affecting each other. It's like a game out there in the real world that's nice to think about is pollution. Like if, I pollute my city and the air in my city, then you in the neighboring city get to breathe the same air. So I directly affect you. My strategy in this game of how much I control pollution is affecting what your life is going to be like in the neighboring city.
Yeah.
Right.
So what,
I mean, it seems like this has sort of been like, so this notion of taking game as a metaphor, it's not just sports or games, but like now lots of things have sort of people acting like players thinking strategically, right?
Yeah, it's true. So what game theory is about is sort of how you do this. How do you take into account all of these effects? How is it that individuals make their choice, needing to have expectation of what others are going to do, and how do they decide what others are going to do? So what game theory does is give you a framework in which you can put all those things together and come up with predictions about what's going to occur.
Right. So, I mean, like, I guess in addition to, actual games that you would play as sports or whatever, I mean, there's also like, say, two companies in the same space in an industry, and they're competing, so they're sort of like the two players in a game, and now they might decide, okay, we each have to choose a price for our product, and how things turn out is going to depend on not just what price I choose, but what price my competitor chooses.
Yeah.
And I guess, so we've all seen like, price wars or things like this where there's now an actual competition going on, played out in the strategy of prices.
Yeah, so it's a good example of that is pricing airline seats, where people search around and they look for low prices, and airlines know this. So whenever any one airline decides on what price it's going to have for a seat that's going to occur, say tomorrow, they really have to take into account what their competitors are going to do, and their competitors are thinking about this too, and that's exactly a game.
I mean, I guess companies can compete on other things like not just price, but maybe quality or even like on standards. Like if I think about sort of a lot of computing settings, Apple releases a new product and decides it's not going to support some standard or some kind of software, and that's now a strategy, as in it's going to sort of deliberately make itself incompatible with what came before. That could pay off because now people have to switch to it, or it could fail.
Yeah.
Those are all issues. And
Some of these pricing strategies succeed in people drawing everyone in. Others do not, and I guess often it's the aspect they competed on that matters. Like the Apple, I think my dominant way of thinking about Apple, that they somehow made the choice to compete on quality rather than competing on price. They didn't make their products particularly cheap. They made it very good quality or very interesting and able to do interesting things.
Right.
That's another aspect, to decide what you compete on. What's the interesting aspect you care to compete on.
Yeah.
Well, if you go back to the pollution example, not to actually try to analyze the game, but just to think about it, it really is the case that one city's or one country's pollution affects other countries. And it could very well be the case that they're all better off if they don't pollute. But in a game, they're all behaving strategically, and there's no reason for the game to necessarily produce that outcome. So one of the things we're going to see with game theory is exactly how you make those choices and whether the outcomes are things that are good or bad. It could be either way.
This is especially powerful when everyone has very, very small effects, like traffic congestion. If there is a big traffic jam on a highway, that's quite unpleasant for everyone. But one car plus or minus not affecting the traffic jam, whether we have a million cars, 1,000,001 cars, or however many the number is. One plus or minus doesn't matter. So people don't directly feel that they're affecting other people, but combined, there is a strong combined effect in which they do affect each other.
Right. Like you put all that together, and now you do have a traffic jam, and that affects everybody. Right? And I guess consumers, by choosing to buy an iPad, I personally have helped make the iPad more popular. So I didn't have any really big effect, but in aggregate, that means this is now a more popular product. And so when people go and decide what should I buy, they're going to take that into account as part of their how they evaluate their payoffs.
Yeah. So I think one of the things we're going to see is that actually games and this idea of strategic behavior are all over the place. They happen all the time. Even if people aren't necessarily doing this kind of analysis in their heads when they're doing something. This strategic influence that others affect what you receive and that what you do affects them is there all the time.
Right. And I guess, yes.
I mean, pre-thinking what everyone else will do, indeed, you don't do it at the level of a car driver or a consumer buying a product because your influence is so small. But companies do it. Like companies do think about if you initially sell a product really, really cheap, that will make it popular. So they think about the direct impact of their current decision in a sort of long-term fashion and thinking through what the implications are. If you're a big player in a market, as in a big company doing something, or an airline in the airline market is not that big.
Right.
Those players do think through what the consequence of the action is and what other people will do to react to those actions.
And I guess at this level of games, like, again, sort of the game metaphor goes a certain way, like, but most sports or games, it's like someone wins, someone loses. But here, games have lots of different, like in the traffic congestion thing, like, by driving on the same road as you, we both lose because we create congestion. But if we both buy the same product, maybe we both win because now, we can interact with each other, or we can, it makes it more popular. So, like, there are all sorts of different, like, some games, like, sort of, we can all win simultaneously. Some games, what I do takes away from you. Some games we all lose simultaneously.
Yeah, that's true. So one of the things we're going to do is build a framework in which we can actually figure all these things out, come up with some predictions, and then it would be interesting to think about designing the game, because in some sense that's part of what companies are doing. As Ava mentioned, choosing the dimension to compete on is to some extent designing the game.
Or even choosing an initial strategy that predicts what other people will do, such as offering products for free initially or very cheaply.
Yeah. Or
in order to convince people to try them out. Sure. That's an initial strategy. It's not that's not what they're going to do in the long term, but it's something that gets them in a good position in a game.
Or if I create a market that follows certain rules, or I create an election system that follows certain rules, I've designed a game, and I could have designed it differently.
Yeah.
And, right, yeah.